We've all heard the term carbon footprint, left, right and centre. What actually is a carbon footprint? Let's find out. Quite simply, a carbon footprint is an approximation of the amount of carbon that you put into the atmosphere, typically, measured over a year. Okay, and we'll come on to how it's measured in a later video. Why do I say an approximation? People want to know precisely what is your carbon footprint. Well, you're never going to get that. It's always an approximation. Okay. As an example, let's take a journey from London to Edinburgh. You can work out the carbon footprint by working out the amount of carbon emitted by the fuel you put in the car. And you can say, well, look, I used X litres going from here to there, and using sort of clever factors, convert that into a measurement of carbon. But, what happens if you stop and buy yourself some chocolate on the way? Do you measure the carbon footprint of that chocolate? What happens if you have the car repaired halfway up? Do you count the car repair? What about the carbon in the actual car itself, or the carbon for the road that it's driving on, etc. On it goes. There's always things that you don't include. So it's always an approximation. And if anybody wants to know what your precise carbon footprint is, you can say, well, it's approximately such and such and such, but never exactly. So it's approximately. To get around this, because otherwise it would be a complete nightmare comparing, sort of different companies' carbon footprints, people use standards, and these standards define what to include and what to exclude from your carbon footprint calculation. There's many different standards out there. The ones that are coming to the fore, the ones that are kind of on the up, are PPN 0621, which is a UK government standard. Net zero, that's the one that I sort of promote in my book, Net Zero for Business. The clue's in the title. And for larger companies, science-based targets. They all work off of a big standard underneath all of those, which is called the GHG protocol, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And that is probably 200 or 300 pages of how you measure carbon footprints, what you should include and should not exclude. If you're starting this, head for net zero. It's a great place to start. If you're a larger company, think about science-based targets, okay? The things that we include in net zero, which are very common certainly in the UK, are business travel, so planes, trains, and automobiles, electricity, gas and fuel, commuting, deliveries, both deliveries you get and deliveries you make, waste, i.e. what waste you generate, and supply chain, so the stuff you buy. That supply chain stuff can be complicated. That's the hardest part of all of these calculations, is the supply chain calculation part. But it is worth including, especially if you're a retailer, reselling some parts of, reselling sort of stuff generally. You buy it in, maybe you buy it in from overseas and then sell it in the UK. Or if you're a manufacturer, so you take in raw materials, process them somehow, and then sort of push them out as finished products. What you can do in that situation, especially if you're a reseller, if you're someone like Amazon, who just buys loads of stuff and sells loads of stuff, is you can actually start talking about two carbon footprints for yourself. Your operational carbon footprint, and that is everything to do with your own operations, your own transport, your own sort of petrol, gas, electricity, etc., etc. And you can then split that out from your kind of embodied carbon of the products that you buy in and then resell out. So you'll end up with two carbon footprints. And I thought I'd show you an example of this. So this is Heathrow's carbon footprint. And you'll see in Heathrow's carbon footprint, it's split into two parts. You've got the air operations and the ground operations. And that's because, Heathrow buy and sell aviation fuel, and it could be argued that they've got less control over the carbon content of that aviation fuel than they do have over the operations of the airport themselves. So that's important, because if you try and start looking at what's your overall carbon footprint, if you are someone like Heathrow, that might make up the vast majority of your carbon footprint, things that you have little control over, such as the carbon content of aviation fuel. But you do have control over the bits that you can influence, in this case, the ground operations. And so you can actually achieve a good carbon footprint reduction by focusing on each problem separately. So you'll have one carbon reduction plan for your things you can't control, in their case the aviation fuel, and a separate carbon reduction plan looking at, well, how can they be a better organisation themselves, okay? It's perfectly fine. And I say resellers, manufacturers, this is likely what you'll see, this twin approach. The last thing to say about sort of carbon footprints is that they change, okay? I wish they wouldn't, but they do. And what happens is, because you include other people's carbon emissions in your carbon footprint, so that's the scope 3s, which we'll come on to in later videos, especially the supply chain, you might want to know precisely what, the carbon content of the things you're buying is. So you might say, specifically, precisely how much is the carbon content of, for example, this pencil or pen. The problem is people don't quite know at the moment, because this is an evolving sort of area of research. People can estimate right now what they know about this particular pen and the carbon content of it. But next year, next month, 2 years' time, all of those sort of calculations get more refined and they get more things included. They use better carbon factors. They put more work into calculating the carbon content of the pen. And when they do, the carbon content of this pen changes. And because this is in your carbon footprint changes as well, okay? There are minor differences with things like the carbon content of fuel, for example, diesel and petrol and stuff like that. It does fluctuate, from year to year, but it's small, it's tiny percentages. But the supply chain aspect, deliveries, waste, etc., all those aspects are always changing. So when you measure your carbon footprint, you can say, well, today, knowing what we know, it's approximately X. But when you do it again in a year's time, it might well change. And we can talk about how we can account for those changes, in later videos. Okay? I hope that was useful. If you think it was, please grab yourself a copy of the book, Net Zero for Business. It's available at Amazon. And if you want to leave a kind review, that's even better. I'd love you even more. Okay? Thanks a bunch.